Life as a nurse in an elderly care home isn't for everyone. It's a world filled with subtle routines, hushed whispers in dim hallways, and the ever-present scent of antiseptic mingling with the musk of old age. My name is Daniel, and this world has been my reality for nearly a decade. You might think such a job is all about the medical aspect, the schedules, the medications. But it's so much more. It's about the quiet moments at 3 a.m. when the world seems to hold its breath, and all you can hear is the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle breathing of someone who's lived a fuller life than you can imagine. In this line of work, you learn to appreciate the small things. The way Mrs. Green lights up when she talks about her grandchildren. How Mr. Jacobs still sets his hair with a comb over every morning, as if he's about to step out for a business meeting, despite having nowhere to go. There's a certain beauty in the decay, a poignant reminder of our own mortality and the ticking clock we all race against. But don't get me wrong, the job is not without its challenges. There are days filled with frustration, sadness, and the heart-wrenching farewells that never get easier no matter how many times you go through them. And there are the secrets. Oh, the secrets that these walls absorb. The confessions whispered during the twilight hours when the barrier between past and present seems to blur, and the heart spills out memories too heavy to carry alone. Nothing, however, prepared me for Mrs. Harrison. From the moment she was wheeled into our facility, wrapped in layers of wool despite the mild weather, her eyes darting around with a mix of fear and disdain, I knew she was going to be different. Most new residents are scared, understandably, but they eventually settle. Not Mrs. Harrison. She seemed to carry a storm with her, a chill that seeped into the bones of anyone who dared approach. Her arrival was like the first few drops of rain that warn of the torrent to come, and little did I know, I was right in the path of the coming storm. The day Mrs. Harrison arrived at our care home, an ominous cloak seemed to drape over the sky, swallowing the last remnants of sunlight. Dark, swelling clouds smothered the horizon, as if heralding the arrival of something ancient and unwelcome. The wind, a foreboding messenger, howled with an intensity that rattled windows and whispered secrets through the cracks of the aging facility. As I stood in the threshold of the main entrance, I couldn't shake off the eerie sensation that we were on the cusp of a change, a disturbing shift in the very fabric of our mundane existence. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence within my own heart, a tumultuous prelude to the unsettling days that lay ahead. Mrs. Harrison, when she finally entered, seemed to be an embodiment of the storm itself. Her entrance was marked by a sudden chill that swept through the foyer, leaving a trail of whispered apprehensions among the staff. Wrapped in layers of wool, she seemed untouched by the warmth of our welcome, her presence casting a long, shadowy silhouette that crept along the walls like a specter. Her eyes, piercing and alert, scanned the environment with a discerning gaze that seemed to penetrate the very souls of those she observed. There was a certain gravitas about her, a silent proclamation that her arrival was not merely a transition into care, but a significant event, pregnant with hidden meanings and silent omens. In the following days, Mrs. Harrison's presence became a catalyst for a series of inexplicable occurrences. Objects began to move of their own accord, doors would slam shut without any discernible cause, and a persistent cold settled in her room, resistant to all attempts at warming. The staff whispered rumors of a curse, and some refused to enter her room without company. Her demands and complaints, initially dismissed as the querulous grumblings of old age, took on a new edge as bizarre incidents accumulated around her. The sound of her voice seemed to linger in the air, a haunting echo that resonated with the growing unease permeating the home. As the nurse assigned to her care, I found myself drawn into her world, a domain ruled by the unexplainable and the eerie. Mrs. Harrison, for all her outward hostility and imposing demeanor, seemed to carry with her a profound sadness, a heavy burden that was palpable in the silent moments between her outbursts. Nights became a theater of whispered secrets and unseen presences. I would often catch glimpses of shadows darting at the corner of my vision, hear the faintest strains of a melody, with no discernible source. Feel the brush of unseen fingers against my skin. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural, once clear and definitive, began to erode, leaving me questioning my own senses. But it was her stories, told in the dead of night when the world seemed to hold its breath, that truly unsettled me. Mrs. Harrison spoke of her past with a haunting intensity, revealing a tapestry woven with dark threads of tragedy, betrayal, and occult dealings. Each confession peeled back layers of reality, exposing a world that thrummed with hidden dangers and spectral sorrows. As the storm outside raged on, unabated, I realized that Mrs. Harrison was not merely reliving her past. She was warning me, ushering me into a world where the lines between life and death, between love and loss, were irrevocably blurred. And in her stories, I sensed an impending revelation, a truth that once uncovered would change everything. Summer arrived, draping the care home in a blanket of warmth and sunlight, a stark contrast to the cold mysteries residing within its walls. Mrs. Harrison, with each passing day, became more of an enigma, her stories weaving a complex tapestry that spanned the breadth of human emotion. It was during one of these long, sunlit afternoons that she delved deeper into the shadows of her past, her voice a whisper, barely rising above the hum of the outside world. "There was a time," she began, her eyes fixated on a spot beyond the room, beyond the present, when love was not just a word, but my entire universe. Her hands, gnarled with age, trembled as she recounted the story of her youthful romance, a tale tinged with the sweet pain of nostalgia and the sharp sting of betrayal. The man she spoke of, a figure from another era, had promised her the world, but left her with nothing but shadows and broken promises. As Mrs. Harrison's story unfolded, I found myself drawn into her world, a young woman's heart full of dreams, suddenly thrust into a reality where those very dreams were her downfall. She spoke of their secret meetings, of stolen moments under the cover of night, of a passion that burned too bright and too fast. But with each memory shared, a darker undercurrent emerged, hints of a sinister truth that lay beneath the surface of her romantic tale. The turning point of her story came on a night much like any other, under the same star-filled sky that witnessed their vows of eternal love. A tragedy, unexpected and unforgiving, tore through the fabric of her happiness, leaving her world irrevocably altered. The details, shrouded in pain and regret, spilled from her lips like dark wine, staining the air between us with the weight of her sorrow. It was then, amidst the rubble of her shattered dreams, that she encountered the entity she referred to only as the Shadow. This presence, dark and elusive, offered her a pact, a chance to reclaim some semblance of the life she had lost. Desperation led her to accept, unknowing or perhaps uncaring, of the price that would come with such a bargain. The Shadow, she explained, was neither friend nor foe, but a force of nature that demanded respect, and more importantly, payment. The cost of her deal became apparent in the years that followed, a series of events that painted her life with strokes of loss and loneliness, each one a reminder of the contract she had unwittingly bound herself to. Listening to Mrs. Harrison, I felt the line between sympathy and fear blur. Here was a woman who had lived through unimaginable pain, who had made decisions in the depths of despair that few could fathom. Her story, a blend of love, loss, and the supernatural, left me questioning the very nature of fate and free will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, the true depth of Mrs. Harrison's confession became clear. This was not just a tale of lost love or a life marked by regret, but a warning of the lengths to which one might go when confronted with the unfathomable. The silence that followed her final words was heavy, filled with the unspoken understanding that some shadows, once cast, stretch far beyond the setting sun. In the weeks that followed, the care home transformed into a realm where the palpable tension between reality and the supernatural throbbed like a living heart. The storm that heralded Mrs. Harrison's arrival had long since passed, yet its shadow lingered, a silent specter watching over us with unseen eyes. Nights in the care home stretched out, endless and thick with anticipation. The air itself felt charged, as if electrified by the whispers of the unseen and the unheard. It was during these stifling evenings that Mrs. Harrison's true nature, or perhaps the nature of her curse, began to unfurl like a dark flower blooming in moonlight. It started subtly, with murmurs in the dark, and fleeting glimpses of figures where no one stood. The other residents spoke of nightmares, vivid and disturbing, that left them waking in cold sweats, their hearts racing against the drum of an ancient fear. But it was the shadows that disturbed me the most, the way they seemed to move of their own accord, twisting and elongating in the corners of my vision, as if animated by a will of their own. One night, a night no different from any other save for the oppressive weight of the unseen, I heard it. A low, dragging sound emanating from Mrs. Harrison's room. My heart clenched as I approached, the familiar sense of dread coiling in my stomach. The door, usually ajar, was firmly shut. Beyond it, the sound continued, a slow, methodical scrape that chilled the blood in my veins. With a courage I didn't feel, I pushed the door open. The room was awash in moonlight, casting everything in a ghostly pallor. Mrs. Harrison sat upright in her bed, her eyes wide and staring, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, half expecting to confront some horror from the depths of nightmare. There was nothing, only shadows and the whisper of wind against the window. But when I looked back at Mrs. Harrison, I saw it. The fear, raw and unmasked, that had stripped years from her face, leaving her a trembling shell of her former self. In the weeks that followed that chilling encounter, the disturbances grew. Objects moved with no one to move them. Cold spots appeared randomly, sucking the warmth from the air. But most terrifying were the shadows. They gathered and whispered in the dark corners, watching, waiting, as if for some unseen signal. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the light, the stress of the job. But deep down, I knew the truth. The care home, our island of the forgotten and the lost, had become a crossroads for something otherworldly, something ancient and hungry. The climax came unexpectedly, a crescendo of fear and revelation that shattered the fragile barrier I had erected between myself and the supernatural. It was an ordinary evening, the care home quiet, but for the usual sounds of the night shift. I was making my rounds when I saw her, Mrs. Harrison, standing at the end of the hallway, her figure bathed in the cold blue light of the moon. But she was not alone. Standing beside her was a figure dark and indistinct, its edges blurring into the surrounding darkness, a shadow among shadows. Mrs. Harrison spoke, her voice a whisper, yet each word struck me with the force of a physical blow. "The time has come," she said, and though her words were directed at the figure, I felt them pierce me, a cold recognition of what was to come. The shadow turned, its gaze, though featureless, locking onto mine, and in that moment, I understood everything. The hauntings, the disturbances, they were all leading to this, a culmination of a pact made long ago, a debt owed to the shadows. Mrs. Harrison, with her tales of lost love and dark bargains, had brought this upon us, a darkness that fed on fear and sorrow. As the figure approached, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and I knew, with a dread that sunk into my bones, that the barrier between our world and the next was about to be breached. The care home, our sanctuary of the aged and the infirm, stood on the brink of an abyss, and I, a mere witness to the unfolding horror, could do nothing but watch as the darkness encroached, ready to claim what was its due. The air was thick with an anticipation so tangible. It was as though the very walls of the elderly care home pulsed with a life of their own. The night following my harrowing encounter with the shadow alongside Mrs. Harrison was fraught with an oppressive silence, the kind that precedes storms of unimaginable ferocity. The residents, usually resigned to their quiet routines, were restless, whispering of unease and shadows that danced just beyond the edge of sight. In the deep recesses of the night, a scream shattered the oppressive silence, a primal sound of terror that seemed to echo from the bowels of the earth itself. I rushed towards the source, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find Mrs. Harrison's room agape, the darkness within swirling like a tangible entity. The scene before me was one of chaos and terror. Furniture lay overturned, the remnants of Mrs. Harrison's possessions scattered as if touched by a violent storm. And there, in the center of the room, stood Mrs. Harrison herself, her frail body racked with sobs, her hands outstretched towards the shadow that loomed before her. This was no ordinary shadow. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, its form shifting and writhing as if mocking the very laws of nature. The moonlight seemed to avoid it, leaving it an abyss of darkness that no light could penetrate. And as I stood there, frozen in horror, I realized the truth that Mrs. Harrison had been trying to convey. Her pact with this unearthly entity was coming to a sinister fruition. The shadow advanced, a silent predator, its presence suffocating, consuming the light, the warmth, and the hope from the room. Mrs. Harrison's cries grew more desperate, her words a mix of pleas and accusations, revealing the depth of her despair and the reality of her torment. I wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare that defied all reason, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as if the very darkness held me captive. The line between the natural and supernatural had not just been blurred, it had been obliterated, leaving me a witness to a realm where the impossible became the horrific truth. In a moment that seemed suspended in time, Mrs. Harrison turned her tear-streaked face towards me, her eyes imploring, begging for a salvation I could not give. It was then, in her gaze, that I understood the true nature of her torment. A lifetime bound to a darkness from which there was no escape. The shadow, sensing my presence, turned its attention towards me, and in its depthless form, I felt the weight of countless lost souls, a well of despair so profound, it threatened to drag me into its abyss. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and in that moment, I knew fear in its most primal form. But it was Mrs. Harrison's final act, a sacrifice born of desperation and love that altered our fates. With a strength that belied her age, she hurled herself at the shadow, a piercing light erupting from her being, illuminating the darkness with a brilliance that was almost blinding. The collision of light and darkness was cataclysmic. A sound, both a wail and a roar, filled the room, vibrating through the very foundation of the care home. I shielded my eyes, and when I finally dared to look, the room was silent, the shadow gone, and Mrs. Harrison lay still on the floor, her final breath a whisper of redemption and release. The aftermath of that night left the care home forever changed. A palpable sense of grief mingled with relief permeated the air, a silent testament to the battle waged within its walls. As for me, the veil of ignorance had been irrevocably lifted. I had peered into the abyss, touched the fabric of the supernatural, and emerged different. The days that followed were filled with questions without answers, a community bound by a shared nightmare, yet isolated in our individual processing of the events. The care home, once a sanctuary, now held the echoes of a truth too terrifying to fully comprehend. But it was in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the dawn, that I felt her presence most acutely. Mrs. Harrison, free from her eternal bondage, seemed to whisper through the shifting shadows, a guardian spirit watching over the place that had been her final battleground. In the end, the legacy of that night was one of awakening, an awakening to the mysteries that dance just beyond the veil of our understanding, to the light and darkness that dwell within us all, and to the unseen battles that shape our realities in ways we may never fully understand.